In 1995, the current patriarch of Russia, of Moscow, Patriarch Kirill, the man with the hugest cufflinks that I think I've ever seen, chaired a conference in Moscow. He did another one in 2000, and both were involved in redefining orthodox practice. And out of both came a recognition and an understanding of the just war. Now, why is this important? Because the theory of a just war, which is put forward by St. Augustine and then Thomas Aquinas, is not accepted in Christian orthodoxy at all, full stop. It has been accepted by Russian orthodoxy, and that makes Russian orthodoxy quite interesting, but it also means that we can question the war in Ukraine against the principles of the just war. Those principles were very nicely laid out by Tony Blair in Parliament just before the Iraq War. And look what trouble that got Tony Blair into. So the idea of the just war, what is it and what does Russia understand by it? Let's look first of all at Russia's conference. It produced a document which was called Sviatsoty Ratnago Sluzhenia, on the sanctity of military service. And you can see why that might have happened, as the Russian church wanted to ally itself again with the Russian state. And it incorporated the principles of this Augustinian theory of the just war. The true believer, it says in the document Basis 2000, the true believer participates in a justified war. So if you are a true believer, you can be involved in a just war. And Putin believes he is a true believer. He likes to be seen making the sign of the cross in public. He likes to be seen in the Russian church. So we need to judge Putin's war against these principles. In this document, it comes out with a very good line, which of course should be kept in mind at the moment in this mass mobilization. The Gospel of John, chapter 15, greater love hath no man that he lays down his life for his friends. But of course, the majority of people are running to the border and are trying to find any way they can to duck conscription. Because there is an understanding across Russia that this war is not just, that this is not a war, that this is a special military operation. And that may be another reason why Putin has so far resisted calling this a war, because he knows that it doesn't fulfill the criteria of a just war. Now, in the concept of a just war, let's have a look at it. It starts with Augustine. Augustine defends the just war with reference to St. Paul's letter to the Romans, chapter 13, verse 3, that God gave as a sword. He then goes on and details his theory in the Contra Fustum Manichaeum against the Manichaeans, against Manichae heresy in chapter 22:69. He says Christians shouldn't be ashamed of going to war to fight for their country, to protect their state, to defend themselves. Okay, so let's look at that. There are often said to be 7 principles of a just war. What are they? The first is that there is a just cause. That your reason for going to war in the first place is okay. The second is that it is done with justice, that there must be injustice that needs righting. The third is that there is proper authority to call that war, that it can't be done by anybody, it has to be done by the leader of the country, the king, the queen, the leader. Only they can proclaim a war. So of those 3, this explains why Russia has gone on and on about Nazis in Ukraine, about Bandera. And I don't think that this is a sizable group. I don't think this is worth going to war over. We have Nazis in many societies. In Ukraine, the Nazi party, the right-wing party, lost votes in the last election. They didn't gain authority. They have no power. So at this stage now, maybe a few years before, there might have been some reason to challenge that group. Now there isn't. Not with President Zelensky in power. Number 4, there has to be right intention. So a war cannot be fought for material gain, only to correct a wrong. So trying to restore the territory of Novorussia, which of course is one of the big campaigns of Mr. Putin, is nonsensical. And what is Novorussia? Because we hear this so often. Novorussia is a specific area above the Crimea. It was defined in 1764, and it didn't last very long. It doesn't embrace the Donbass, it doesn't embrace Luhansk. So all of this nonsense is cod justification. It isn't genuine. It's rubbish propaganda put out by people who don't know the facts. And the West has not challenged these facts at source. We need to get into the we need to get the facts across. We need, and we have needed for a long time, to be challenging this war, the basis of this war. We need to have been doing this. We should still do this. These ideas need to be challenged in the media. This is the job of the media. This war, the biggest weapon in this war for Putin is media. So if we're not dealing with that weapon, we are failing. So, right intention. Right intention, probability of success, a last resort. We have to make sure that that the war is the last thing we do. It has to be only after all peaceful means are exhausted. Were there negotiations before this war? No. Were they exhausted? No. And number 7, proportionality. So the idea of threatening a nuclear option to a nation that gave up its nuclear weapons to the nation that is now attacking it is outrageous, is utterly outrageous. So was there a probability of success in this war? That is questionable. That's point 5. Was there right intention solely to correct a wrong, not for material gain? That again is questionable. The last resort idea, number 6, utterly questionable. And proportionality, we can see Putin's threats, utterly questionable. So even if there is some justification for the war in the first 3 points of the just war theory, there is none in the last 4. Putin fails on 4 of those points, absolutely. And it is questionable whether he whether he wins on the first 3 points. When it comes to the next principle of the just war, the idea of jus in bello, the idea that a war can be fought justly, Putin fails absolutely. There are 5 points here. The first, that there is distinction, that a war only attacks soldiers, not civilians, that acts of reprisal or acts against civilians, prisoners of war, acts of torture, these are completely unacceptable. And these are all demonstrated in what we've seen on the news, in the reports that we're getting, particularly from places like Bucha, from the towns which have been recaptured by Ukraine from Russian occupation. As for torture, we wait for the testimony of people like Aden Aslin. So that is important. 2, proportionality. There have to be legitimate military targets and objectives. Well, we know that Russia just throws bombs at things. There's no justification for attacking Kiev. There's no justification particularly for attacking Lviv. Why were these cities attacked? No justification at all. The principle is that the harm must not exceed the direct military advantage. Great harm has been done throughout Ukraine. It mustn't lead to unnecessary deaths. So many deaths of civilians have been caused. And as for the deaths of soldiers, Russia is underreporting the number of soldiers killed, Russian soldiers killed in the campaign so far. 55,000 is a modest assessment. Russia is claiming about 5,000 have been killed. This is nonsensical. And the lie is proven in the draft. Putin has no reason to draft soldiers if most of his soldiers have not already been killed. The new soldiers who are going out, the new conscripts who are going out as cannon fodder, are literally going out to die. So Russian conscripts need to recognize that. They have good reason to fear for their lives. They have good reason to run to the borders. And we need to get that message across. So distinction, proportionality, necessity is the third one. There have to be legitimate military aims. So, for example, the atrocity in Bucha, completely unacceptable. There has to be fair treatment of prisoners of war. Again, we come back to Aden Aslin. Number 5, there has to be no use of evil weapons. Now, this is an interesting one. In Latin, it's malum in se. And Augustine and Aquinas and those people who were talking about the just war during the Middle Ages were thinking of an army that made the enemy fight against its own side. But the option of a nuclear strike, the option of nuclear threats against a nation that has no nuclear weapons is completely abhorrent, is utterly, utterly wrong. The third area of the just war is what happens afterwards, jus post bellum. And for this, you really ought to look at John Maynard Keynes and the Economic Consequences of the Peace. Great book, where he looks at the Treaty of Versailles and how badly that was conducted, because that basically ignored all of the principles in the jus post bellum. There are 4. The first, that there has to be an apology and compensation. Second, that there has to be right intent, not revenge. Third, that there has to be discrimination again, that only those who were directly responsible for the war should be punished. And number 5, there has to be proportionality. So the basic aim of any sort of peace negotiation is to resume normal service as soon as possible. Now, I started by saying that Orthodox Christianity does not recognize the just war. Russian Orthodoxy does, and under this particular patriarch, it formulated a theory of the just war which appropriated the theories of St. Augustine and indeed Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas reduces the idea of the just war to 3 points: that it has to be called by the sovereign, that it has to have just cause, that it has to have the right intent to promote good and to destroy evil. He was basing his theories on the Decretum Gratiani, which is a 12th century document, and he wrote about it in detail in the Summa Theologica. I used to have a very nice copy of the Summa Theologica. It ran to many, many volumes, and I had a pet rabbit, and the pet rabbit lived in a fireplace, a lovely old inglenook fireplace, and it had a large grate, and when the rabbit got too old, I thought I needed to lift up the grate, so the rabbit had a suitable enclosure, and I used copies of the Summa Theologica, all the copies of the Summa Theologica, to build up a little fence around the rabbit's enclosure, and during the night I could hear the rabbit digging into Thomas Aquinas and ripping out pages and munching on them. And the rabbit obviously read so much more of Aquinas than I did in those days. But there we are. Patriarch Bartholomew, who is the ecumenical patriarch, still is the ecumenical patriarch, and he was in communion with Russia at the time that he said this in 1999 on a trip to Novi Sad, which is in Serbia. And he said very clearly, he articulated the orthodox idea that a just war is impossible, that only peace is possible. Bartholomew said in Novi Sad, war and violence are never means used by God in order to achieve a result. They are the machination of the devil. And he quoted St. Paul's letter to the Romans, chapter 12, verse 21, do not be overcome by evil, overcome evil with good. So in orthodox theology, in patristics, there is no concept of the just war. It is Russia who has embraced this idea, so Russia must be judged against it. And we, in the West, need to get this idea out. We need to get this idea into the Russian media. So ordinary Russians know that they are right to flee for the borders from this evil man, because on his own rules and with the support of his evil archpriest, he is failing. On his own rules, he is failing. And that is important to know and to recognize. So I hope this is of some use in clarifying. I'm sorry to have been so much of a teacher today, but it's been slightly necessary, I think. Maybe.